Hi there, welcome to 19th Century Art. In this first lecture, I want to give a brief introduction into the 19th century by looking at some of the major things that were happening at this time. To begin with, let's look at the extraordinary change in the style of art at the beginning of the 19th century in this painting by Jacques-Louis David, and at the end of the 19th century, this painting by Paul Gauguin. In this shift, which is so dramatic in this time, and perhaps more dramatic than any time in the history of art, the fundamental changes occur not only in what people consider beautiful, but also just foundationally what the artist is trying to represent, where those ideas are coming from, and what is the role of the artist in society. For Jacques-Louis David, this very important idea of art comes from this Greek notion of mimesis, imitation, that art should be an imitation or mimesis of reality. This mimetic purpose of art was to record and to create an ideal that was understood by everyone. As we go to the end of the 19th century, this has been completely exploded by this notion that art emerges out of the individual artist, and it is their unique vision, their unique take on the world. We can see this important change in the role of the artist in the difference between two very important musicians. The first, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, who was an absolute gifted genius and became an important composer at court. During his life, he was given the job of making special musical accompaniment for royal events. And this was the traditional role of the artist in the royal court. They were commissioned to do very specific projects for the nobility, and the nobility would grant them license to engage the community and represent them in a flattering way. Next to the other generation of brilliant composers, and we find Ludwig van Beethoven, who, again, an incredible prodigy who was able to excel in such a unique way. His Symphony No. 5, first performed in 1808, is truly a revolutionary work of art from the mind of a genius. He was different than Mozart. He too had royal patrons, but they no longer expected him to create works for their needs. He was given a license to create whatever he wanted. Is now at this point, the artist and the artistic genius is understood as something separate from the needs of the nobility. The idea of art and its place in the world was very different than it is today. And when we think about it, this is really important to look at this painting here, which is recreating the Salon in the Tribuna of the Uffizi. And in this gathering, we see white men from all over Europe gathered together to admire and critique works of art of classical antiquity and new creations as well. And in this way, you can see how the audience would be expected to acknowledge and recognize the gifts of the artist. Of course, this audience is predominantly male, and they are of a class and education and skill that gives them this privilege and access to this work. Before this time, nobody but the nobility and these elite were given any kind of access to this work. It's also important to note that this work is categorized, it's organized and sorted in ways that there is a hierarchy among the kinds of arts that they are admiring, not only between the sculpture in and around these men, but also in the paintings hanging on the wall. Notice how packed together they are. This was a very common practice to fill every inch of the walls with every painting they could. But there is a hierarchy implicit in that hanging, that in the upper register you have the history painting, the most important paintings of the day. And then below that, these smaller portraits, landscapes, still lifes were there to kind of demonstrate skill and ability. But it was the history painting that was really the premier art form of the day. And people looked to it for very special, important messages and meanings. So what is history painting, and how is it different from other portraits, landscapes, and still lifes? Well, here's an example of a traditional history painting by Titian in the 16th century, and this sort of captivates a lot of the sort of conventions of history painting. It was a massive painting. It was an ambitious painting. It had multiple figures arranged in a setting with a landscape, and the drapery and the figures and the sense of movement and the relationship is all there to tell a story. It's there to communicate an important episode in Greek or Roman mythology. And this, of course, Diana and Actaeon. Actaeon, the hunter, has come and found Diana, the goddess of the hunt, and revealed bathing with her goddesses, and she turns him into a stag. And you can actually see a stag skull kind of looming up in the upper part of the painting. And again, this is all foreboding, for Actaeon will be changed into a deer and he will be killed by other hunters. So in this scene, we have a kind of moral message. We have a landscape, we have the figures, we have still life, all of it coming together in this kind of symphony, this grand gesture toward the importance of the philosophy and ideals of the classical past. So history painting was this extraordinary fusion of all the great arts that people recognized in the day. Now, history painting itself was undergoing an extraordinary change. Instead of relying entirely on Greek and Roman stories to create moral messages, Benjamin West, when he created The Death of General Wolfe in 1770, shifted the narrative to the present day. And in it, he creates a spectacular history painting about an event that happened just a decade earlier. On September 13th, 1759, there was this incredible war at the Battle of Quebec, and it was an important turning point because at this point, the French are defeated and retreat from the continent of the Americas, and the British take over the French colonies from Quebec to Florida. This is a major shift and growth and expansion of power in the British Empire. And so this is commemorated in this, and the sacrifice of General Wolfe, who died in that battle. Now, there have been lots of songs and plays commemorating General Wolfe and his heroic feat of defeating the French. And this painting is sort of ennobling those themes and ideas by setting it as a history painting. Now, notice the gestures that these figures are in. They're all very dramatic. They're all based on classical ideals. General Wolfe in the center of the painting is collapsed, and he's held up by his assistants as if he is the dying Christ on the cross. And directly opposite him is this very striking Iroquois Native American who is studying the scene with grave intensity. And these two create a kind of counterpoint, a kind of narrative sense of the significance of this moment, that General Wolfe, even as he is dying, has achieved this great thing. He has brought Britain into the Americas and established the legitimacy of the British rule over the Iroquois. Now, the Iroquois were aligned with the British in this war, though there were no Iroquois present in this battle. And this moment that's captured here is not a historic recreation of an actual event, but is a kind of fiction meant to dramatize the values and ideals. And so when we look at this kind of a painting, we can't say it's simply real. It's very imaginary in the way it's been composed and created, but it is more real than real to the people who view it because it embodies the values and ideas that they hold dear. So we call this verisimilitude. This is something that is real-like, but it is considered more than real because it speaks to these core values. So this is a transformation that's happening not just in painting, but in the real world. This coalescing around these ideas would transform Europe into this kind of scattered, competing, various royal powers into some serious juggernauts of military might and industrial strength. There's unities that come with being a nation that establishes colonial power over all kinds of places in the world. These transformations, this idea of democracy, the idea of the transformation away from the absolute monarchies, was fueled by a group of men who believed in this idea of science above all, and they have been called the Enlightenment. And this is this transformation. And there were quite a number of men. I want to talk specifically about Denis Diderot, who was a brilliant writer and scientist in his own regard. And he was an advocate for moving out from the theology that dominated the universities, the church, which dominated the schools of thought of the day, and establish new scientific basis for society. And so he envisioned this encyclopedia, and that it would be this culmination of all of human knowledge at this time. And it was published between 1751 and 1772 in 35 volumes. Okay, he believed the technology and the knowledge that would be here would free people from the shackles of the past. It was 71,818 articles written by 100 different contributors. Denis Diderot did many of them himself. So this was important because he wanted to establish that there was a source of knowledge independent of the Bible. And it was this way that he could push back against the dogma of the day by establishing that these are the truths that we know scientifically to be true. And he, in private, would say such things as man will never be free until the last king is strangled with the entrails of the last priest. He was an atheist who had great disdain for any kind of dogma or theology. Of course, he came under attack from the church and he had to couch his words very carefully. You could be hauled before an inquisition. This was a time when it was important to take careful strategic steps. The encyclopedia had 3,129 illustrations of common technology and the latest innovations. It was so vast and so ambitious that problems in the paper supply caused the publisher to temporarily suspend publication so that they could find the 36 million sheets of high-quality handmade paper. Science was on the periphery of society. It was not fully embraced. It was feared, and it was something that people felt suspicious of in many ways. But there are these societies that banded together, and they came and had lectures, and they learned about the moment of the scientific discoveries of the day. Here in this wonderful painting by Joseph Wright of Derby, we see an experiment on a bird in the air pump. In this, we see a bird in a glass chamber, and the scientist with the wild white hair in the background is going to suck the air out of that chamber and the bird will pass out. That's why you see the young girls below kind of hiding their eyes, fearing for the fate of the bird in the chamber. But of course, he will open the chamber again and return air to it, and the bird will be revived. And this was a way to demonstrate the importance of something as invisible as oxygen. And so here we find this wonderful scene illuminated by this battery in the foreground with this light coming out and all the people in this circle who are coming about. You're also known through the window. The other light is the moon, the full moon coming through there. These people who gathered together, they would often come together. They were called lunar societies. And on the Monday nearest the full moon, they would come and gather to get these lectures. What's beautiful about this painting, it's quite large and dramatic, is that it's about this intimate moment of ordinary people. It's not a history painting per se. It's actually what you would call a genre painting, because it's not about the sort of grand and noble themes of the past. A genre painting could also be large and ambitious, but its subject is prosaic. It's about everyday people and everyday life. Now, the style of this painting, with its dramatic light source, this is not chiaroscuro of the Italians. This is tenebrism, that single source of light emanating out in all directions. Thinking and new ideas were coming to the fore, not only from these lunar societies, but also what was called the penny universities. These were coffee and tea drinking establishments where people would gather together. Newspapers could be found, and people would discuss the business of the day. And this is quite a change, because a coffee house, of course, people are buzzing and happy and engaged, and it's quite different from a pub or a bar where people are muddle-headed at best. And so coffee was embraced on the European continent, and England began to embrace tea drinking. And in these times, these stimulants created an environment for these new communities of rational thinkers to emerge. So at this time, we're looking at these change in societies. The slave trade was being abolished. People in the coffee houses were demanding equal and fair rights. This is the community that began to look out. And as the slave trade dried up, these empires needed to have control over these weaker kingdoms in the periphery. And so they used their incredible military might and technological power to rule over them in absentia. In a sense, the colonial expansion meant that they would extract resources from these other countries in Asia, in Africa, and in South America. And by extracting those resources, they would then use them to mass produce cheap goods that they could then sell to these people that they had power over. They could control the market. They could insist that they buy their cheaply made goods. So the people of these other countries and other parts of the world, they didn't just sit down and take it. They fought back, of course, and thus we have the Opium War between China and Britain. There's two of them. The Dutch had a major war in Java from 1825 to 1830, and the U.S. forces Japan to open its borders in 1853. In India, the people of India rebelled in 1857. Each case here, the colonial powers won. French in Indochina, the Belgian in the Congo of Africa, they each were able to carve out large parts of these territories and rule over them quite ruthlessly. And in this time, and there was actually only 2 wars in which the indigenous people were effectively able to fight back. The Ethiopians expelled the Italians, and the Japanese defeated the Russians. In the United States, of course, during this time, we were also greatly expanding across our continent in what was known as manifest destiny. And to achieve this unity across from coast to coast, there had to be this great expelling of the Native Americans. And the war with the Native Americans was really ongoing and brutal, with only brief interludes of peace treaties that were quickly broken. Starting in 1637 with the Pequot War, we really come to a dramatic conclusion at the Trail of Tears between 1830 and 1850, when masses of populations of Native Americans were driven from their homes without any kind of comfort and taken to the far side of the Mississippi River. And in this transformative time, we see them completely divested and destroyed as a civilization. The last major battle that occurred was really a massacre at Wounded Knee in 1890. So the power of these nations really owes to the Industrial Revolution that came about from the harnessing of steam power. And it was really the engineering and the ability to manufacture higher grade steel and finer materials that provided the mechanism that they could harness steam and then eventually coal to power these giant machines. And the industry that had always been and relied on handwork was now done in an incredible speed. Just for an example, many different industries were mechanized. Paper is one, of course, that has direct influence on the nature of this class and art. The demand for paper was enormous. Newspapers kept growing and they were printed every single day, and they grew larger and larger. And so to keep up with this demand for paper, they started to mechanize paper making. And the encyclopedia, which is entirely made by handmade paper. And now you have this machine that can drive and build sheets of paper faster and more accurately than ever before. And so this machine is running in 1852, the Foundry machine. And it's really even the basis of the machines that are used today to make paper. So let's look at the printing press. Another major innovations are happening at this time. So 1800, we have the cast iron printing presses that allowed printing presses to go from about 250 pages per day to about 480 pages per hour. 1810, not even a decade later, we're now doing 1,100 pages per hour with steam-powered presses. And then not even by mid-century with the rotary press, people are producing millions of pages per day in these printing presses. So this is an extraordinary transformation. All of this paper, of course, in printing is having a massive impact on the way people perceive the world and the way in which they engage in the world. And it's important to remember when we talk about technological change that the technology is not the thing that drives the change. The demand precedes the technology. So when they do studies about, how many people were reading, it's not like someone invented the printing press and then suddenly everyone started reading more. It's actually that people wanted more to read. The demand for reading was there. And technology provides for that change. It doesn't create the change. It cements the change that had already taken place and allows for more changes in the future. So the technological change the evidence suggests came after the expansion of reading was already underway and were more a result than a cause.